You see, nobody wakes up one day and decides to stop trusting themselves. It doesn't happen in an instant. It happens slowly over time, and more often than not, it begins quietly. So quietly that we don't even notice it. A failure, a rejection, a betrayal, a dream that didn't work out the way we imagined. Little by little, the confidence we once had in ourselves begins to erode, not because we're weak, but because life has a way of convincing us that we are. I want to begin here, because before you can trust yourself again, you have to acknowledge, without shame, without judgment, that somewhere along the way you stopped. And I say this with love. Many of us are walking around wearing masks of strength while quietly doubting everything we are. We show up to work. We fulfill our responsibilities. We smile for the world. But inside we question every decision. We second-guess our instincts. We seek validation for things we already know. That isn't self-trust. That's self-abandonment in slow motion. But let me tell you something that might sound radical. Self-doubt is not a character flaw. It is not proof that you are broken. It is, in fact, a signal, a psychological response. When trust in yourself breaks, your mind enters a state of self-preservation. Your inner voice begins to whisper things like, "Don't try again, you might fail," or "Stay silent, you could be wrong," or even worse, "You're not enough." These thoughts, however convincing, are not truth. They are survival strategies crafted by a brain that is trying to protect you from further disappointment. Think of it this way. When someone else breaks our trust, we recognize it as betrayal. But when we betray our own needs, our own boundaries, our own truth, we often don't recognize the damage. We internalize it. We say, "Maybe I deserved that," "Maybe I wasn't capable enough." And the longer we carry those thoughts, the more foreign we become to ourselves. Let's be honest. Some of you have dreams you stopped chasing, not because they were impossible, but because somewhere along the line, someone told you that you weren't capable, and you believed them. Some of you gave love, poured your heart into people, and when they left or hurt you, you didn't just lose them. You lost trust in your own judgment. You started thinking, "If I chose them, and they did this to me, maybe I don't know what's good for me after all." And some of you, perhaps the most quietly hurting of all, have failed spectacularly, publicly, privately. And instead of understanding that failure is an event, not an identity, you made it personal. You attached it to your worth. You told yourself, "I can't be trusted with big things anymore." Let me pause here and say something very clearly if this resonates with you. If any of this feels familiar, you are not alone and you are not beyond repair. What you are experiencing is deeply human. Here's the hard truth and the hopeful one you cannot rebuild what you don't first acknowledge is broken. You cannot heal from what you're unwilling to admit is hurting. So if you're going to trust yourself again, you have to start by telling yourself the truth. Not the curated truth you offer the world, the real one. The one that says "Yes, I lost faith in myself. Yes, I stopped believing I could make good decisions. Yes, I've been scared to try again." There is no shame in that. In fact, there is great strength in that admission, because that's where the rebuilding begins. Not in pretending everything's fine, not in faking confidence, but in coming home to yourself and saying, "Something broke inside me, and I am ready to start repairing it." This isn't about ego, it's about integrity. Self-trust isn't arrogance, it's alignment. It's the quiet, steady knowing that no matter what happens, you can rely on yourself to show up, to speak your truth, to honor your needs, and to try again. But you cannot arrive at that place until you're willing to stand still and feel the weight of your own disconnection. It takes courage to confront the silence between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. But that silence, that uncomfortable space, is sacred. It's not emptiness. It's a signal that something within you is asking to be heard again. So hear it. Sit with it. Don't rush to fix it. Just listen. Because when you acknowledge that you've lost trust in yourself, you open the door to finding it again. And that is where your journey begins. Not in striving to be perfect, but in daring to be honest. If you're going to rebuild something as important as trust, start with yourself. Because the relationship you have with you is the foundation for every other relationship in your life. Now that we've acknowledged the break in self-trust, it's time to ask a far more difficult question. Why? Because trust doesn't just disappear. It doesn't dissolve in thin air. It deteriorates from something. Something happened. Something caused it. And until we are willing to face that something, We remain at its mercy. You can't fix what you haven't yet faced. For many of us, the loss of self-trust wasn't one loud, dramatic moment. It was subtle. A comment someone made that lingered a little too long in your mind, of a failure you never really processed, a rejection that shook the foundation of who you believed you were, or worse, a pattern. A long stretch of being made to feel like you were never enough, even when you gave everything you had. Over time, those experiences create internal fractures, and if we don't examine where they came from, we end up mistaking them for truth. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly in your own heart. When did you start doubting yourself? Not when you started feeling insecure, not when you started playing it safe. Go further back. Can you remember the first time your voice trembled because you were afraid to be wrong? Can you remember when you stopped listening to your own instincts and started outsourcing your choices to everyone else? That's where the wound lies. You see, many people walk through life avoiding this question because the answer often lies in discomfort. Sometimes it lives in our childhood, in a home where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned, where being too much or not enough could change the emotional temperature of the room. Sometimes it lives in school systems that rewarded obedience over curiosity, compliance over courage. Other times, it lives in relationships, romantic or otherwise, that chipped away at our identity under the weight of manipulation, control, or chronic invalidation. And sometimes the cause isn't even dramatic. It can be as simple as a long series of small decisions made while we were too tired, too pressured, or too afraid to say no. And then one day we look in the mirror and realize we no longer recognize who we've become. That's not weakness. That's human. Psychologically, what's happening is not just about events. It's about the meaning we attached to those events. A failure doesn't ruin your self-trust, but believing that the failure means you're not capable, that belief does. A broken relationship doesn't destroy your self-worth, but concluding that you're unlovable, that story does. And it's the story, not the circumstance, that we carry into every new chapter of our lives. That's why identifying the root isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about breaking the narrative loop. Because if we don't locate the root, we water the weeds instead of the truth, we spend years trying to fix the symptoms, perfectionism, procrastination, of overthinking, without realizing they're just protective responses to a deeper wound. Let's go even deeper for a moment. Philosophically speaking, trust is an internal contract between your past, present, and future self. When that contract is violated, when your past self made choices that hurt you, or your present self is paralyzed by fear, you lose faith in your future. That's when doubt takes over. That's when you hesitate. That's when you sabotage. You're not broken. You're not lost. You're responding to a perceived breach in that contract. So what do? You get curious, not critical. You ask, what belief did I adopt at the moment when I stopped trusting myself? You ask, was that belief mine? Or was it someone else's voice I started carrying around as my own? And then you go further. You start distinguishing fear from fact. You begin separating who you truly are from who you had to become in order to survive. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what happened to me that made me forget who I was? That question, what happened to me, is not about assigning blame. It's about reclaiming authorship. Because if your doubt was learned, it can be unlearned. If your self-trust was broken, it can be rebuilt. But only if you're willing to look at the blueprint, only if you're brave enough to go back to the place it all began, not to stay there, but to understand. This part of the journey is not comfortable. It requires reflection. It requires silence. Sometimes it even requires grief. The grief of realizing how long you've lived in a version of yourself that wasn't rooted in truth, but in fear. But do you know what lies on the other side of that grief? Clarity. And with clarity comes choice. Because when you understand why you lost trust in yourself, you stop being controlled by it. You stop playing small. You stop seeking answers from people who never understood your questions in the first place. And you begin the sacred work of coming back home to yourself. Not as you were told to be, but as you actually are. That is the first real step to trusting yourself again. Don't just ask yourself what you've lost. Ask yourself where you lost it. Because once you find that place, you can stop avoiding it and start rewriting it off. Once you've acknowledged the break in your self-trust, and once you've taken the brave step of identifying where it came from, of there's something else you must do, something that can be even more challenging than facing your past. Of you have to question the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. Because here's what's true: pain doesn't just wound us. It writes scripts in our minds, narratives, patterns of thought. And over time, we start mistaking those narratives for our identity. We say things like, I'm just not good with people. I always mess things up. I can't handle pressure. I attract the wrong kind of people, or the quietest and most dangerous of them all. Maybe I'm just not meant for more. But ask yourself, where did those words come from? Who taught you that? Of who handed you that script and told you to memorize it as your truth? Because that script, I promise you, wasn't written by the real you. It was written by the wounded you, by the part of you that had to make sense of failure, rejection, disappointment, and fear. And it did what the mind is wired to do. It tried to protect you by simplifying the pain into a single story, one that sounded like, you can't trust yourself. Psychologically, this is called a cognitive distortion, where our brain, after repeated emotional blows, starts filtering everything through a lens of fear or failure. It's not because we're broken. It's because we're human, and humans make meaning, constantly. We try to understand why things happened, especially when they hurt us. But too often, we look for answers in the wrong place, in self-blame, in shame, in minimization of our own worth. And so the story begins. And because we've told it to ourselves so many times, it becomes our default. Even when life presents us with new opportunities, even when people believe in us, even when something inside us wants to rise, we hesitate. Not because we're incapable, but because the story says, this will end badly, just like last time. Philosophically speaking, the danger of false narratives is that they collapse our complexity. They reduce the whole universe of who we are down to a single chapter. But you are not a single chapter. You are not the version of you that made one bad decision. You are not just the person who failed that once, or the one who got hurt and never fully recovered. That version of you is real, yes, but it is not the whole truth. So what does it mean to challenge a false narrative? It means developing the courage to question your own conclusions. It means stepping back from the emotion and asking, is this really true, or is this just familiar? Because sometimes the most familiar stories are the most damaging, not because they're accurate, but because they've been repeated so many times, they've settled into our nervous system like fact. This is where healing begins to take on a new tone. It stops being about repairing what's broken and starts being about remembering what was never truly lost. Your essence, your intuition, your voice. They may have gone quiet, but they've always been there. And you don't have to replace every false narrative overnight. That's not how the mind works. But you can interrupt them. You can start noticing when they show up. When that inner critic says, don't even try, you'll embarrass yourself, you can respond with, that's one story. But it's not the only one. This isn't about fake positivity. This is about radical honesty, the kind that allows space for two truths to exist. Yes, I have failed before. And yes, I am still worthy of trying again. Yes, I've made mistakes. And yes, I've also grown from them. Yes, I've doubted myself. And yes, there is still wisdom in me I haven't even tapped into yet. You see, the problem with false narratives is that they keep us loyal to a version of ourselves we've already outgrown. And the longer we stay in that place, the more we betray our present self in an attempt to protect our past self. But self-trust isn't built on staying small. It's built on giving yourself permission to evolve, even when it scares you, especially when it scares you. So I invite you to pay attention to the stories you tell yourself when no one else is listening. Because those stories shape your choices, and your choices shape your life. The good news, you are the narrator, and narrators can change the script, but only if they're willing to tell the truth. Not the loudest truth, not the most rehearsed truth, but the deepest one. The one that says, I am not who they said I was. I am not who I was in my worst moment. I am not done becoming. Just because you've believed a story for a long time doesn't make it true. So start telling the kind of story your future self would be proud to live in. Now that we've confronted the false stories that hold us back, we're left with a critical question. How do we begin again? How do we rebuild self-trust after it's been fractured? The answer is deceptively simple and yet deeply powerful. You begin by making small commitments and keeping them. That's it. because rebuilding trust with yourself is no different than rebuilding trust with another person. Think about it. If someone hurt you, or disappeared when you needed them, or broke their promises repeatedly, would you trust them again just because they said they've changed? Of course not. You'd need proof. You'd need to see consistent effort. You'd need to feel safe with them again slowly, over time. And it's exactly the same with you. You can't talk your way into self-trust. You live your way into it. By making small, honest, manageable commitments to yourself and keeping them even when no one else is watching. Now let me be clear, this is not about achieving perfection or becoming hyper-disciplined. That's not trust, that's performance. This is about showing yourself that you can depend on you. That when you say, I'm going to take care of myself today, or I'll speak up when something doesn't feel right, or even just, I'll drink more water, you follow through. Not because the task itself is extraordinary, but because the act of honoring your word is sacred. What this does, psychologically, is begin to repair the breach in your internal integrity. You start to experience your own reliability, and the mind learns to stop questioning your intentions because your actions begin to align with them. It's not about size, it's about sincerity. We often think confidence is something you feel, but in truth, confidence is something you earn. By repeatedly showing up for yourself, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when no one is clapping, and when those small actions begin to stack up, something amazing happens. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop needing permission. You stop outsourcing your power to circumstances, because your confidence is no longer situational, it's internal. Philosophically, this kind of confidence comes from congruence, from being in harmony with yourself. When your words, your choices, and your values begin to match, you start living in alignment. And alignment creates peace. Not the peace that comes from everything being easy, but the peace that comes from knowing you are no longer betraying yourself to keep the world comfortable. Let me give you a real example. If you say, I want to live a healthier life, but every day you abandon that intention, not because you're lazy, but because you're overwhelmed or exhausted or afraid of failing, then every time you ignore that promise, a little part of your trust erodes. Not because the behavior is wrong, but because it doesn't align with what your heart knows is true for you. But if instead you start small, maybe it's just stretching in the morning, or drinking water first thing, or putting your phone down before bed, you begin to send yourself a new message. I care about you. I respect your goals. I'm here for you. And isn't that what trust is at its core? A consistent demonstration of care and presence. The mistake many people make is thinking that change has to be dramatic to be meaningful. But healing isn't about intensity. It's about consistency. Anyone can be inspired for a day, but transformation happens when inspiration becomes devotion. And devotion doesn't mean grand gestures. It means choosing yourself in the quiet moments. It means doing what you said you'd do, even if no one else notices, because you notice. And over time, those small wins become proof. Not to the world, but to yourself. Here's something else that matters. Don't confuse speed with success. This is not a race. You're not trying to rebuild trust on someone else's timeline. You're rebuilding something that's real, and real things take time. Brick by brick, moment by moment, you begin again. And yes, there will be days when you fall short. There will be days when you break your promise to yourself, but when you slip back into old patterns. But those days don't define you. What defines you is what you do after. Do you show up again tomorrow? Do you speak to yourself with grace instead of shame? Do you remember that trust is a relationship, and all relationships require repair? That's the difference between people who rebuild their lives and those who remain stuck. Not perfection, but persistence. A quiet, unwavering willingness to try again. So ask yourself, what's one small thing I can do today that aligns with the person I'm becoming? Not the person you used to be. Not the person you're expected to be. The person you are deep down under the fear and fatigue and doubt. That version of you is still there, waiting for your commitment. Not your performance. Not your promises, your commitment. Confidence is not found in the grand moments. It is built in the quiet ones, where no one is watching, but you choose to show up anyway. By now, we've talked about acknowledging the break in self-trust, identifying its roots, challenging the false narratives and rebuilding confidence through small, consistent action. But there is one more truth you must embrace if you're going to fully trust yourself again, And that is this: you are allowed to evolve, and not just allowed, you are meant to. Evolving is not betrayal of who you were, it is an honoring of who you are becoming. But somewhere along the way, many of us became afraid of change, afraid to grow, afraid to outgrow. We stay in places we've outlived, hold on to versions of ourselves that no longer fit because we confuse comfort with identity. We tell ourselves, this is just who I am, when what we really mean is, this is who I've been for so long, I don't know who else I could be. And so we shrink, we suppress. We stay silent when our voice wants to rise. Not because we don't have the potential, but because we fear what our growth might cost us. But let me say this to you clearly. Evolving doesn't mean you reject your past. It means you reframe it. You take the lessons, the strength of the wisdom, and you leave behind the version of yourself that was built only to survive. Survival is not your identity, it's just a chapter of, and healing begins when you give yourself permission to turn the page. Psychologically speaking, we all form what's called a self-concept, an internal image of who we believe we are. This image is shaped by our experiences, our upbringing, our relationships, our culture. But if we're not careful, we start treating this concept like a cage. We cling to it. We say, I'm not the kind of person who speaks up, or I've never been good at taking risks, or I'm too sensitive, too broken, too late. But these aren't truths. They're all definitions, and definitions can be rewritten. Philosophically, identity is not fixed, it's fluid. The only constant in life is change, and yet we resist it in ourselves more than anywhere else. Why? Because change threatens our sense of stability. But what if, instead of fearing that evolution will make you lose yourself, you saw it as the path to finally meet yourself? Fully, without the masks, without the limitations, without the roles you were taught to play. Because there is a version of you that exists beyond your pain, beyond the disappointments, beyond the image you crafted just to be accepted. That version is still alive in you. It may have gone quiet, but it's not gone. You don't need to become her. You need to remember her, and that remembering happens when you stop defining yourself by your past and start defining yourself by your potential. Not potential in the sense of achievement or status, but in the sense of becoming more honest, more aligned, more whole. But here's the hard part: evolving often requires loss of approval, loss of predictability, sometimes even loss of people who only love the version of you that made them comfortable. And that's painful. But not evolving comes with its own cost. Your spirit, your authenticity, your joy. And let me tell you something I've had to learn the hard way. You cannot build self-trust if you're constantly abandoning your own growth just to fit into the expectations of others. Real self-trust is not rooted in who you've always been. It's rooted in who you're willing to become. And sometimes becoming means breaking patterns, disappointing people, saying no where you used to say yes, setting boundaries where you once remained silent, owning your story without shame, choosing peace over performance. It's not always beautiful. It's often messy. But it's real. And realness is where trust is built. Because when you show up as your evolving self, your honest, complex, imperfect, courageous self, you begin to witness your own resilience. You begin to see that you're capable of more than you gave yourself credit for. And that's when the inner shift happens. That's when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your worth. That's when you stop apologizing for changing. Because what you're really saying is, I trust myself enough to grow, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's unfamiliar, even if not everyone understands. So if you've been waiting for a sign to stop holding yourself back, let this be it. You don't owe the world your consistency. You owe yourself your evolution. You can outgrow mindsets. You can outgrow pain. You can outgrow roles that were handed to you before you had the power to say no. And in that process, you will not lose yourself. You will find yourself. You are not here to stay the same. You are here to become. And self-trust begins the moment you stop clinging to who you were and start rising into who you are meant to be.